As Alex says, I'm continuing our series on breaking barriers. And this week, we're thinking about the question that most of us who are Christians have probably been asked before by our friends or family, or if we're honest, we've been asking ourselves. And that is, this all sounds great, but can you prove it? I didn't grow up going to church. As a family, we only ever went to church for weddings, baptisms, or funerals. And even then, often we'd skip the church bit and just meet them at the pub for the party. Jesus was spoken about at 3 different occasions in our household: Christmas, Easter, and if my dad stubbed his toe and didn't want a stronger expletive in front of my little sister. Easter, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, are the foundation of the Christian faith. Our symbol is a cross. Easter, we kind of might know the basics of it if we were brought up a little bit like me, the idea that Jesus, the Son of God, died on a cross and then 3 days later rose again. But in effect, Easter for us was just about eating an obscene amount of chocolate and not really thinking about why. The meaning of Easter definitely didn't affect our lives. Since I started following Jesus, Easter has been completely different for me. There's still plenty of good food around, but now it's so much more. Easter is a time of joy and incredible gratitude to Jesus as we celebrate new life. It's like a birthday, but so much more, because this is the day in history that transformed my life and billions of other people's lives. It's the day when Jesus proved that he is who he says he is. The day he showed that nothing is too difficult for him to overcome. So for us to establish just how good the resurrection is, first we've got to establish this really simple fact. Jesus died. Jesus was beaten, tortured, crowned with thorns, and after all this, was forced to carry all or part of a cross that weighed about 140 kilograms, 2.5 kilometers up a hill. After all of that, he had nails hammered into his wrists and feet and slowly suffocated on the cross. Some people say, well, maybe even after all of that, he didn't die on the cross. What if he just passed out? A friend of Jesus called John wrote this. Now, it was the day of preparation, and the next day was to be a special Sabbath. Because the Jewish leaders did not want the bodies left on the crosses during the Sabbath, they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. The red blood cells and lighter plasma, which could be perceived as water, separate after the sort of death that Jesus endured. So we know from this tiny detail that Jesus was definitely dead. His body was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen, and placed in a cold, dark tomb guarded by soldiers. The next day was the Sabbath. The Sabbath is supposed to be a day of rest and worship, but it's a day where his friends are afraid. They're full of grief and unable to practically do anything about it. Then Sunday comes. The sun begins to rise as a group of women set out to care for Jesus' body by treating it with spices and perfumes. They're getting towards the tomb, wondering who will move the stone for them that weighs at least a ton. But as they get closer, they see that the stone has already been moved. Who moved it? What's going on? They reach the tomb and peer in and see that it is empty. The women don't know what to think. Where is Jesus? But angels appear like lightning and tell them, don't be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. Why do you look for the living among the dead? He isn't here. He is risen, just like he said he would. Remember? The penny starts to drop as the angels say to the women, go. He is on his way to Galilee now. Go and tell his disciples that you've seen the tomb empty. You've heard that he is risen. Go and see for yourselves. The women go to leave, and they are met by Jesus, alive and well, radiant, and calling them by name. They clasp at his feet and worship him. They're quite naturally afraid, but filled with joy because Jesus is risen, and they race off to find the disciples. Jesus is risen. No? Don't care. Don't care. Cool. This was great. See you later. Jesus is risen. He's alive. He's been dead in a cold, dark tomb for 3 days, and now he is risen. Jesus' death and resurrection are the foundation of our faith because they prove to us that Jesus is who he says he is. Loads of people in history have claimed to be God or godlike figures. They've claimed that they can beat death, cheat death, but then they died and they never came back. Jesus is the only one who is victorious even over death. He came to save us no matter what the personal cost. But before we can get to that, let's take a look at the resurrection itself. So how do we know that the resurrection happened? Can we prove it? The Bible records the resurrection throughout each of the Gospels, the stories of Jesus. Some go into more detail than others about what happened at the tomb, how the stone was rolled away, or the personal interactions that people have with the risen Christ. The things that they all agree on are the stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, Jesus was alive, and the women got there first. Come on. Thing is, if you're not sure about Jesus, or you can only think of him as a spiritual being, then the idea of a physical resurrection might sound a bit crazy to you. So what proof do we have that Jesus actually rose from the dead? Well, first there's the empty tomb. Many ancient non-Christian, even anti-Christian texts admit that Jesus' tomb was empty, and that even the Jewish leaders who crucified him admitted that the tomb was empty. There are 3 different explanations that people who don't believe in Jesus' resurrection try to use for the empty tomb. Number 1, the authorities, religious or political, stole the body. Number 2, the disciples stole the body. Number 3, the grave robbers stole the body. So first, the authorities. Matthew's gospel tells us, while the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. If the authorities had stolen the body, why would they need to take any time to devise a plan? They'd know the truth. Also, when they saw the disciples were claiming that Jesus was risen and saw how many more people were being inspired by this good news of the God who destroys death, why wouldn't they just produce the body? So I don't believe that it could have been the authorities. Secondly, we have the disciples. Now, I can't believe that they would have stolen the body either, because they were deathly afraid. So afraid that they scattered when Jesus was arrested and even pretended that they never knew him. Yet just a few days later, they went from hiding in fear to courageously, boldly declaring that Jesus was, is, and always will be the Messiah. Even when they were beaten, imprisoned, and killed for that message, they didn't stop. How would they find the courage to be willing to die to declare that Jesus is Lord if they knew that it was all built on a lie? So I don't think it was them. Thirdly, there's the grave robbers. They can't be responsible because they left the only thing that would have been of value in the tomb, the grave clothes. They were expensive, heavy linen. They would have been easily sold or traded. Why would they have left them behind? Also, the tomb was guarded by soldiers. How would they have gotten past? So if we can assume that the tomb was definitely empty, how else can we prove that Jesus came back to life fully, not as a ghostly presence, but fully alive again and never died again? Well, after his resurrection, Jesus was seen more than 10 times, once by a crowd of over 500 people. We know that he was physically present and not just a ghost because the women were able to clasp at his feet. And he even asked one of his friends, Thomas, who wasn't too sure about the whole thing, to put his hands in the holes in his wrists and in his side. The stories of Jesus' time on earth talk about him walking with people, having conversations, teaching publicly, cooking, eating, having fun with people. So people ask, well, Could that have just been hallucinations? You know, the disciples are really distraught. But that doesn't really work, because we're not dealing with people here who are sick or highly imaginative or dosed up on drugs or alcohol. The disciples are skeptics. How many times did Jesus have to question them on their faith? How many times did he have to remind them of his words? These are tough fishermen like Peter. They were diligent and detail-orientated like Matthew, the tax collector. And let's be real, anyone who deals with money does not hallucinate. Not only was Jesus seen when he was first resurrected, he is still encountering people today. Across the world right now, there are over 2.5 billion people who are choosing to follow Jesus, devoting their whole lives, careers, reputations, energy, and money to seeing God's kingdom come. This isn't just people's way to reach enlightenment either. The church across the world are spearheading improvements to society, especially in terms of justice. The NHS, the abolition of the slave trade, and free education all came from the Sunday school movement. A friend of mine who's a vicar often tells people, I work for the world's biggest volunteer organisation, responsible for most of the food banks and free child services everywhere. Here in our own church, we see people spurred on by the love of Christ to care for the people around them who are lonely, hurting, and seeking asylum. Why would we take the personal sacrifice that these things take to care for others if it wasn't for Jesus being alive and calling us to follow him? Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, Kirsty, sure, this sounds great, but your only proof for most of this comes from the Bible, and of course that would say it. But actually, there are plenty of historical texts that record the death and resurrection of Jesus. So let's take a look at a couple of them. So first we have Josephus. He was a Jewish priest, scholar, and historian alive at the time of Jesus, and he's never understood to have followed him or believed his claims, and yet he records this in his work, The Jewish Antiquities. About this time, there lived a man, a wise man, Jesus, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day, he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. Next, we have Tacitus, a Roman historian and politician born about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. He says this in the Annals. Christ, there you go, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Now, he's clearly not a fan of Christianity, is he? He's aligned it with all things hideous and shameful. Sure, Tacitus doesn't endorse the claims that Jesus was resurrected, but he does affirm that the mischievous superstition, people declaring that Jesus is Lord, was quelled for a brief time when Jesus died, but then something, we believe the resurrection, made it break out again, not just in Judea, but even in Rome. To be honest, I can't believe that Tacitus can describe this as a superstition when he then records the violence that Emperor Nero was inflicting on Christians. He says they were covered with the skins of beasts. They were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight expired. Who would be willing to be burned as a torch for an emperor's garden party for a superstition? You might not like walking under ladders, but if the option was to be burnt alive or do that, I'm pretty sure I know which one you'd choose. Across the world right now, there are thousands of people having to flee their homes. People who are convinced that Jesus rose again, is worthy of praise, and whose lives are changing to reflect that. They are calling Jesus Lord, even though they know that if anyone found out that was the case, they would have to answer with their lives. This following Jesus thing isn't just a superstition. It's not a nice story or an ideology for them. It is a truth that they are willing to die for. Whatever you believe, we can't deny that the story of Jesus being told in his living memory carried enough weight that it was seen by historians and politicians as fact. Not religious truths or spiritual enlightenment, but a hard, cold fact. Jesus died and he was resurrected. So if we can accept that Jesus came back to life, why does it matter? Jesus made some bold claims about who he was and what he had come to earth to do. He said that he was the Son of God who had come into the world to save it. He claimed to be the healer who could set people free from pain, suffering, illness, sadness, loneliness, demonic oppression, fear, and even the death sentence brought upon them by their own mess. He said, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." The resurrection matters because if we can prove it, which I think we can, then that means that Jesus proved that all of these claims are also true. And so that means without Jesus, we'll always be hungry and thirsty, unfulfilled and discontent. Without him, we'll have to walk in darkness, pain, sadness, and disappointment without any hope of breakthrough or any sense of safety. Without him, we can never truly get to know our Father in heaven, who adores us and has great gifts for us. Without Jesus, we'll be fruitless. And even before our mortal bodies experience death, we'll be walking in it. You've heard a little bit of Carl's story today. Life without Jesus only ever brought fleeting happiness. And it's hard for those of us who know Carl now to imagine him as anything other than the kind, joyful, compassionate, courageous family man that we know and love. It's hard to even picture him ending a conversation with anything other than "God's good" or "praying for you." And that's because Jesus is in the business of transformation, of bringing the dead to life. When I first met Jesus, I was 11. When the drama group I was part of closed down, I was invited to a church youth group. And when I walked in, I met a bunch of young people who were super excited to let me in on their games and their conversations. They didn't check that I belonged to their tribe or what music I listened to. They just welcomed me in. I found people that weren't afraid of the future or drowning in sadness because they were utterly convinced that Jesus is alive today and is walking with them in every moment. I wish I could say that since that moment, I've stayed close to Jesus, knowing that he is everything I need, and more than that, that he's the God who created the universe, created me, knows me, loves me, gave up his life for me, and deserves my worship and my life. I wish I could say that, but it's just not true. There have been seasons where I've walked away from Jesus. I didn't deny that he was alive. I even recognized that he was with me most of the time. But I forgot that he was the answer to my thirst for love and contentment. I forgot that he said that I could hear his voice and be led by him. I forgot that the only place of safety and fruitfulness is in him. See, the truth is, sometimes life is hard. It throws things at us that we're not prepared for. The news is devastating. Politics and politicians become more hopeless. The planet is dying. So what are we supposed to do? When the difficult parts of reality set in, Where do you go looking for a solution? Russell Brand, the comedian, once said, "Drugs and alcohol are not my problem. Reality is my problem. Drugs and alcohol are my solution." We can't run away from the reality of life. We can't run from the parts of ourselves that are broken. When I was 4, a teacher screamed at me for counting potatoes incorrectly on a worksheet. Ever since that day, I've worked my hardest to prove that I was good enough, that I could achieve things, that I was smart. And I did. I got 11 A stars at GCSE, I got a first in my degree and a distinction in my master's. Thank you, yes. Thank you. That's the only reason I'm here. Little brag. Thank you very much. I did all of that. I achieved some stuff, but none of that could quieten the voice in my head that said, "You're rubbish. You're a failure. And you'll never be good enough." Now, there were times in those seasons where I walked away from Jesus where that was the only voice that I had to listen to. So I would work harder, party harder. I'd put myself in situations that were dangerous and painful just to prove that I could, that I wouldn't fail, that I could get through it. And all it did was hurt me. How do you cope with the painful parts of your reality? Drink? Drugs? Sex? Do you cover up your emotions that people can't get too close? Do you work every second of the day just to try and prove yourself? We need Jesus. We can't muster up hope within ourselves. We're not well enough and whole enough to take everything in our stride and still believe that we are worthy of love and connection. We're not loving enough to treat each other well in every situation and to care for those in need. We don't have the power to control our past, our present, or our future. We are powerless against sickness, powerless against fear, powerless against shame, powerless against our separation from God, unless the stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, and Jesus is risen. Me and my husband, Dan, lead one of Penny Lane's groups, and this week we asked some of them, "How do you know that Jesus is alive?" Here's some of their answers. This first one might be my favorite. "Christians have good vibes." How good's that? I love it. "I've got friends who are Christians and friends who aren't, and they're all good, kind people, but there's just something about Christians that's different. They just have better vibes. And the only explanation I can think of is that Jesus is alive and he's doing something in the people that follow him." Somebody else said, "I know Jesus is alive because I know that my hope and joy are not dependent on me or my situation." Another said, "To me, it's the fact that no one, no matter what religion or belief, can deny the existence of Jesus historically. Even the Quran calls Jesus the Word of God. And the fact that whoever reads Jesus' own words, they can instantly feel that there's something different, there's something more to him than a mere prophet." We started to have a little bit of a chat about prayer, how we know Jesus is alive because he communicates with us and answers our prayers. And someone asked, "Yeah, but what do we say to people who think that's just mindfulness or speaking things into the universe and hoping that they'll happen?" Somebody replied, "I know the answers to my prayers aren't simply me finding the answer within myself, because God often surprises and challenges me. He asks me to do things I would never instinctively think to do, and when I do, I look back and think, wow, you really know what you're doing, God." Another said, "Look, the more I pray, the more coincidences seem to happen. Some people might want to think that's just the universe, but I'm pretty certain it's Jesus." What do you put your hope in? Hope in the Bible is so much stronger than we can perceive it. When we say our hope is in Jesus, it means that we have a certainty that everything will be okay in his hands. Because there is nothing that is impossible for our God. Even death is not the end with him. The symbol of his greatest pain becomes the symbol of his greatest victory. And when we walk with him, our pain, brokenness, and biggest failures can become stories of his greatest victories too. Because he takes us from death to life. So do you know that Jesus is alive? Can you prove it? One way that we prove that Jesus is alive is the way that we glorify him. So I'm going to invite the band to kind of make their way back up. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever met those Christians, okay? And when you speak to them, you're like, stop breaking it, thank you. You're like, do you believe in Jesus? And they're like, yeah. Do you know that he's alive? Yeah. Tell your face. Oh my gosh, it's so hard meeting these Christians. I'm sure you've never met them. I have, obviously not here, but I've met them, okay? And tonight I want to challenge you and encourage you. This is the greatest story ever told. It's the greatest victory ever won and the greatest news that you will ever receive. Jesus loves you. He died for you. He is alive and wants to walk with you and transform you into his image with ever-increasing glory so that you can be a life bringer, a joy bringer, a peace bringer who laughs in the face of the future and isn't afraid because you have a sure and certain hope in Jesus, the resurrection and the life. Do we believe that? Yeah? Amen. Do we believe it? Yeah? He is risen indeed. Absolutely. Come on, let's stand and we're going to celebrate together by singing and declaring how good our God is.